Susan Mitchell couldn't help but laugh when she saw the wrinkled prayer card clutched in Maria Santos's trembling fingers. The elderly woman's oxygen levels were dropping fast. Her family crowded around the ICU bed, whispering desperate Hail Marys. And here, she was gripping a faded image of the Virgin Mary like it might actually save her life. 15 years of critical care nursing had taught Susan that medicine saved lives, not miracles. She'd watched hundreds of patients die while their families prayed to statues and saints, their faith as useless as the wilted flowers they brought to decorate sterile hospital rooms. The heart monitor's urgent beeping filled the silence between prayers. Maria's daughter pressed rosary beads against her mother's pale hand while her son held a small Virgin Mary statue near the bedside. The family's whispered Spanish prayers mixed with the mechanical sounds of life support, creating what Susan considered a perfect example of false hope meeting medical reality. Dr. Rodriguez entered with the latest test results, his expression grim. The family looked up expectantly, their faith-filled eyes searching his face for good news that Susan knew wouldn't come. She'd seen this scene play out countless times before, always ending the same way despite all the prayer cards and religious medals scattered across hospital bedside tables throughout the ward. Susan reached across Maria's bed to adjust the foredrip when something impossible happened. The small Virgin Mary statue on the bedside table began glowing with soft blue light that had no source, no logical explanation. She froze mid-motion, staring at the ceramic figure that seemed to pulse with warm radiance. The heart monitor's frantic alarms suddenly steadied into a normal rhythm. Maria's oxygen levels climbed from critical to stable in seconds, defying every medical protocol Susan had memorized. The ventilator readings shifted from emergency red to healthy green while the family gasped and pointed at their glowing statue. Dr. Rodriguez dropped his clipboard, his eyes wide as he watched impossible vital signs normalize on every screen. Nurse Patricia crossed herself in the doorway, witnessing what 15 years of medical training had never prepared Susan to see. The other ICU patients' families peered through glass doors, drawn by the unexplained light emanating from room 314. Maria's eyes fluttered open for the first time in 3 days. Her daughter sobbed with joy while her son held up the radiant Virgin Mary statue, its glow now filling the entire room with peaceful warmth. The medical equipment registered perfect health readings where minutes before everything had indicated imminent death. Susan stood paralyzed, watching her rational worldview crumble around scientific instruments that confirmed what her mind refused to accept. The hospital erupted into whispered arguments by the next morning. Half the nursing staff gathered around Patricia in the break room, describing the miraculous light they had witnessed, while Susan's allies dismissed the entire event as mass hysteria combined with equipment malfunction. Susan refused to acknowledge what everyone had seen. She filed an incident report claiming faulty electrical wiring caused the glowing effect, despite maintenance finding no problems with room 314 systems. Her explanation grew more desperate as colleagues pointed out that electrical issues couldn't restore a dying woman's vital organs or wake her from a coma. Dr. Rodriguez documented Maria's impossible recovery, but couldn't explain it medically. Every test confirmed perfect health where terminal organ failure had existed hours before. The Catholic nurses began bringing their own families to witness Maria's miraculous healing, while Susan's secular supporters avoided the wing entirely. Maria's family filled the hospital chapel with flowers and prayers, thanking the Virgin Mary for their mother's life. Their joy created a stark contrast to Susan's bitter insistence that coincidence and modern medicine deserve the credit. Other patients' families began requesting room transfers to be near the miracle site, believing proximity might help their own loved ones. The division spread beyond the hospital walls when Maria's story reached local news outlets, forcing Susan to defend her rational worldview against mounting evidence that defied every medical principle she had trusted for 15 years. Susan's mockery intensified over the following weeks. When elderly Mr. Thompson asked her to place his crucifix where he could see it during dialysis, she laughed and suggested he trust the machines instead. The rosary beads Mrs. Chun brought for comfort during chemotherapy became another target for Susan's sharp comments about primitive superstitions. Her colleagues began stepping around her during patients' spiritual moments. Patricia volunteered for every shift that involved families praying at bedsides, while other nurses requested schedule changes to avoid working alongside Susan during visiting hours when religious ceremonies took place. Hospital chaplain Father Martinez filed a formal complaint after Susan interrupted him giving last rites to a dying patient, declaring that medical intervention was more valuable than empty rituals. The nursing supervisor called Susan into her office twice that month, warning her that patient families were specifically requesting she not be assigned to their loved one's care. Susan's cynicism poisoned her home life as well. Her teenage daughter Emma asked why their family never attended church like her friends' families, and Susan's bitter response about religion being a crutch for weak minds left Emma confused and hurt. Her husband David suggested they visit his mother's Catholic parish for Easter, but Susan's hostile reaction ended the conversation and created tension that lingered for days. The isolation deepened as former friends distanced themselves from Susan's increasingly harsh attitudes toward faith and hope. The phone call came during Susan's night shift in early October. David's voice trembled as he explained that Emma had collapsed during soccer practice and was being rushed to Children's Hospital. Susan's hands shook as she drove through empty streets, her medical knowledge painting terrible scenarios she couldn't silence. Dr. Williams delivered the diagnosis with gentle precision that Susan recognized from her own conversations with families. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, aggressive form, advanced stage. Emma's test results filled multiple pages with numbers that spelled out a prognosis Susan had delivered to other parents countless times before. The oncology team outlined treatment options with the same professional compassion Susan had watched colleagues use with terminal patients. Chemotherapy protocols, radiation schedules, experimental drug trials that might buy time, but offered no guarantees. Emma asked why she felt so tired all the time, and Susan found herself speechless for the first time in her nursing career. Sitting beside Emma's hospital bed, Susan faced the helplessness she had witnessed in so many other families. Her 15 years of medical expertise meant nothing when her own daughter needed healing that science couldn't promise. Emma's quiet question cut through Susan's rational defenses like a blade through paper. "Mom, why did you never teach me how to pray? I see other kids praying when they're scared, but I don't know how." Susan stared at her daughter's pale face, realizing that her crusade against faith had left Emma defenseless against the very fears that drove others to seek comfort in something greater than medicine. Emma's condition worsened despite aggressive treatment. The chemotherapy that should have slowed the cancer's progression barely made a dent in her rapidly declining blood counts. Susan watched her daughter grow weaker each day, the same way she had watched Maria Santos fade before the miraculous intervention that defied every medical law. Late one November night, when Emma's fever spiked beyond what medications could control, Susan found herself walking through empty hospital corridors toward a place she had avoided for 15 years. The chapel door stood open, revealing the same Virgin Mary statue that had glowed with impossible light in Maria's room months earlier. Susan approached the altar slowly, her hands trembling with desperation rather than faith. The ceramic figure seemed smaller in the dim chapel lighting, less threatening than the religious symbols she had mocked throughout her career. She knelt awkwardly on the padded kneeler, unsure of proper prayer posture or sacred words that might reach divine ears. Her pride fought against the humility that circumstances demanded. Every rational thought argued that ceramic statues couldn't heal terminal illness, that hope built on supernatural intervention was dangerous self-deception. Yet Emma's innocent question about prayer haunted her conscience, and medical science offered no promises for her daughter's survival. Susan stared at the Virgin Mary's painted face, remembering the impossible light that had saved Maria's life when medicine failed. She whispered her first prayer in decades, a desperate plea that felt foreign on lips accustomed to dismissing faith as superstition. The Virgin Mary statue began to glow with the same blue light Susan remembered from Maria's room. This time she didn't flee or seek rational explanations. The ceramic figure's painted eyes seemed to look directly into her soul as warmth filled the empty chapel around 3 in the morning. A gentle voice spoke without words, reaching Susan's heart rather than her ears. "Peace, daughter. Your Emma will be healed, but first you must heal the wounds you have caused. Seek forgiveness from those whose faith you mocked, and your own faith will grow strong enough to move mountains of doubt." Susan felt presence surrounding her that defied medical understanding, yet brought comfort her professional training never could. The Virgin Mary's message continued flowing through her consciousness like warm light, penetrating 15 years of accumulated cynicism and pride. "You have seen my power heal Maria when medicine failed. Now you must choose whether to trust in that same power for your daughter's life. But faith requires humility, and humility requires acknowledging the pain you have caused others who sought comfort in their darkest hours." The glow gradually faded, leaving Susan alone in the chapel with tears streaming down her cheeks. For the first time in decades, she felt something beyond her medical expertise, offering hope for Emma's survival. The Virgin Mary's instruction echoed in her mind as she walked back toward the pediatric wing. She would seek forgiveness from every patient and family she had hurt with her mockery, starting with Maria Santos, who had experienced the miracle Susan now desperately needed for her own daughter. Susan began her journey of repentance at Maria Santos's bedside the next morning. The elderly woman had returned to the hospital for routine follow-up care. Her miraculous recovery, now documented in medical journals, that couldn't explain her complete healing from terminal organ failure. "I mocked your faith when you needed comfort most," Susan whispered, tears falling onto Maria's prayer card. "I laughed at your Virgin Mary statue while you were dying, and I'm ashamed of the pain I caused your family during your darkest hours." Maria's weathered hands reached up to touch Susan's face with gentle forgiveness. She found Mr. Thompson receiving dialysis treatment. The same crucifix she had ridiculed now positioned where he could see it during the exhausting procedure. Susan knelt beside his chair and asked forgiveness for dismissing his sacred symbols as primitive superstitions when faith was all that sustained his hope. Mrs. Chun welcomed Susan into her chemotherapy session with grace that humbled her proud heart. The rosary beads Susan had mocked were wrapped around frail fingers that offered blessing rather than condemnation. Each patient she visited responded with mercy that contrasted sharply with her own years of harsh judgment. Father Martinez listened to Susan's confession in the chapel where she had experienced divine intervention. She admitted to interrupting last rites and mocking religious ceremonies, seeking absolution for 15 years of spiritual pride that had wounded countless souls seeking comfort in their suffering. The weight of forgiveness felt heavier than condemnation, transforming Susan's heart in ways her medical training never could have prepared her to understand or accept. That evening, Susan knelt beside Emma's hospital bed with authentic humility for the first time in decades. Her daughter's pale face reflected the same terminal exhaustion Susan had witnessed in countless patients before their families turned to desperate prayers she had always mocked. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," Susan whispered, using words she had learned from patients whose faith she had ridiculed. "Please heal my Emma the way you healed Maria Santos. I believe now in your power to do what medicine cannot accomplish." Her prayer flowed from genuine faith rather than desperate bargaining. Emma stirred slightly, opening tired eyes to see her mother praying with the same devotion she had dismissed in others for 15 years. "Mom, you're praying like Mrs. Santos taught me yesterday. She showed me how to hold rosary beads and ask the Virgin Mary for help when I'm scared about dying." Susan's heart broke realizing that Maria Santos had given Emma the spiritual comfort she had been too proud to provide. The elderly woman whose faith Susan had mocked had become her daughter's teacher in the sacred mysteries she had rejected throughout her nursing career. By morning, Emma's blood work showed impossible improvement. Her white cell count normalized overnight, while cancer markers dropped to undetectable levels. Dr. Williams stared at test results that contradicted every medical prediction, documenting another miraculous healing that defied scientific explanation. The same divine intervention that had saved Maria Santos now flowed through Emma's fragile body, proving that the Virgin Mary's promise in the chapel had been fulfilled through Susan's transformed heart and authentic faith. Susan proposed renovating the hospital chapel during the next staff meeting, her voice carrying new reverence for the sacred space where she had encountered divine intervention. The small chapel had served patients and families for decades, but worn carpeting and faded paint reflected years of neglect by administrators who viewed spiritual care as secondary to medical treatment. Patricia and the Catholic nurses eagerly volunteered to help, their forgiveness complete as they welcomed Susan's leadership in creating a beautiful sanctuary. Even colleagues who had avoided her during her cynical years joined the restoration project, inspired by Emma's miraculous recovery and Susan's obvious transformation. They painted walls in peaceful blues and whites that reflected the Virgin Mary's colors. Susan personally selected new kneelers and prayer books from multiple faiths, ensuring every patient could find comfort regardless of their religious tradition. The hospital chaplains from different denominations blessed their interfaith approach to healing ministry. Maria Santos and her family donated funds for stained glass windows depicting scenes of divine healing, while Mr. Thompson contributed handcrafted wooden crosses for each prayer alcove. Mrs. Chin's family provided silk flowers and prayer cushions that honored various spiritual practices within the renovated sacred space. Emma, now fully recovered and radiant with health, helped arrange religious artifacts from grateful families whose loved ones had experienced healing through prayer in the chapel. Her young hands placed each sacred item with reverence Susan had never taught her, but which flowed naturally from witnessed miracles. The restoration project became a community celebration of faith triumphant over doubt, healing victorious over despair, and grace transforming even the most resistant hearts. Susan's ministry to dying patients began naturally as families requested the nurse who had experienced miraculous healing firsthand. She held trembling hands that once clutched prayer cards she had mocked, offering comfort rooted in authentic faith rather than professional obligation. Her presence brought peace that medical training alone could never provide. Dr. Williams sought her guidance when his own daughter faced serious illness, trusting Susan's testimony of divine intervention over purely medical protocols. The physician who had documented Emma's impossible recovery now asked for prayers alongside prescriptions, integrating spiritual care with scientific treatment. Patricia invited Susan to lead prayer groups for hospital staff struggling with their own faith questions. Nurses who had witnessed both Maria's and Emma's miraculous healings gathered weekly in the renovated chapel, sharing stories of divine encounters during their medical careers and finding strength for challenging patient cases. Emma joined her mother's ministry, visiting pediatric patients with the same radiant health that defied her previous terminal diagnosis. Young cancer patients found hope in Emma's testimony of miraculous healing, while their families drew comfort from Susan's transformation from skeptic to believer. The skeptical colleagues who had once supported Susan's cynical worldview began approaching her privately, sharing their own spiritual questions and witnessing the peace that faith brought to impossible medical situations. Her testimony bridged the gap between scientific knowledge and spiritual mystery. Susan became known throughout the hospital as the nurse who brought both medical expertise and divine hope to families facing their darkest hours, proving that faith and science could work together in healing ministry. Susan's testimony spread through medical conferences where she shared how miraculous intervention had transformed both her daughter's health and her own hardened heart. Skeptical healthcare professionals from other hospitals sought her guidance when facing their own impossible cases that medical science couldn't resolve. The renovated chapel became a pilgrimage site for families seeking healing, with Susan and Emma serving as living witnesses to the Virgin Mary's power over terminal illness. Maria Santos often joined them, her own miraculous recovery inspiring countless others to trust in divine intervention when medicine reached its limits. 5 years after Emma's healing, mother and daughter continued their ministry together. Emma studied nursing to follow her mother's career while maintaining the faith that had sustained her through childhood cancer. Their shared testimony proved that miracles could create generational transformation in families touched by divine grace. Susan received letters from medical professionals worldwide who had witnessed their own impossible healings after hearing her story. Emergency room doctors prayed alongside life-saving procedures, while oncology nurses offered spiritual comfort with the same devotion they provided medical care. The hospital chapel's prayer request book filled with testimonies from families whose loved ones had experienced healing that defied medical explanation. Each miracle strengthened the community's faith while attracting new believers who came seeking the same divine intervention that had saved Maria Santos and Emma Mitchell. Have you experienced a moment when faith transformed your professional life or healed what seemed impossible? Share your story of divine intervention in the comments below and let others know how grace changed everything.